I welcome all of you to this very important session we're going to have with Konstantin Eggert. But first, I would like to begin by thanking our co-sponsors for joining forces with us today. And they are UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies, Berkeley Center for International Relations, and Luskin Department of Public Policy. Thank you all. Konstantin Eggert is an independent Russian journalist and political commentator based now in Lithuania. Actually, he's a columnist and program host for Deutsche Welle, which I hope I pronounced correctly. From 2016 until 2018, Mr. Eggert worked for TV Rain, Russia's groundbreaking independent TV channel. He also worked for Kommersant, Russia's oldest private media group, as well as for ExxonMobil Russia, Inc., where he was vice president for public and government affairs between 2009 and 2010. From 1998 until 2009, Mr. Eggert was with the BBC World Service, including 7 years as the BBC Russian Service Moscow bureau chief from 2002 until 2009. In 2008, Her Majesty, the Queen, made Eggert honorary member of the Order of the British Empire, MBE. Wow. He is a summa cum laude graduate of the Moscow University Institute of Asian and African Studies. And let me tell you, as I was just telling him, he wrote me a note about something, and I looked right at it and I said, my God, he would be perfect for a webinar on dealing with the current crisis. So, ladies and gentlemen, we will first begin by his remarks, relatively short, and to give the vast number that we have today with us chance as best we can to ask questions. We're going to focus on that. So, Konstantin?
Professor Spiegel, Mani, Salome, all the people at UCLA, many thanks for the invitation and for this possibility to share my thoughts about what goes on today in Ukraine, what are, in my personal view, the roots of what happened, and probably try to describe where Russia is going from here, again, in my personal opinion. I was born and raised in Moscow. I traveled extensively in Russia. I actually met Putin, and at the same time, I would like to say that everything I say is strictly my personal opinion. It shouldn't be ascribed to Deutsche Welle, to the BBC, or to ExxonMobil, or to the Queen of England, because it's all very personal. And because I know that there are going to be quite a lot of questions, let me start with a brief outline of what I think about the current situation and about the maybe where the West went wrong with Russia. It's going to be very subjective, and you are free to challenge me in your questions and remarks, of course. So a lot of it is going to be kind of statements. And I would like to start with, so it's going to be more general than more specific, because I do think we'll go into a lot of specifics later. And frankly speaking, I would like to do it also because the situation is very fluid. And actually, as we speak, I get messages on my iPhone from my friends in Lviv or Lvov in Western Ukraine, which is now under quite intense missile bombardment by the Russian forces. So things do turn on a minute. And I think, speaking about turning, I think that what started on the 24th of February and I prefer to call it Putin's renewed war, or second stage of Putin's war against Ukraine. This marks, in my view, an irrevocable turn, a kind of benchmark, watermark, in Russia's transformation from an authoritarian regime, maybe quite strict authoritarian regime, to a militarized dictatorship, which I think will continue. And at the same time, I don't think it will reach the kind of the full Stalin mode, because there are no resources for that, frankly speaking, no ideology. And the wobbliness of the Putin system, of the government apparatus, is, frankly speaking, also quite astounding in terms of its inefficiency and corruption. But it is now, to all intents and purposes, a dictatorship. And just to illustrate it, Reporters Without Borders just published their reports, annual reports, and in it, Russia, in terms of, for example, freedom of media, is below Belarus by probably 1 or 2 points, but still below. You can imagine what kind of achievement, quote unquote, is that. So I do think it is irrevocable. And that is an observation number 1. Number 2, I think, I believe that this war will continue. And I believe that without it, the existence of the Russian regime will be actually endangered. I do not think that the Kremlin or Putin or whatever he calls the Russian authorities will care about basically specific military goals. I think the continuation of this war has now become essentially the reason for the existence of this regime, and it's the explanation, legitimation of its continuous grip over Russia. That doesn't mean that this war will never end or that this regime will reign forever, but we can talk about it later. I think that in the minds of the people in the Kremlin, there is no way back. The Kremlin car just doesn't have a reverse mode, reverse gear. Number 3, I think that this is, and that's important, this puts paid to a lot of myths. This particular stage in Putin's ongoing conflict with Ukraine, which started with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. But this particular stage, these 60 plus days, mark a very significant end to a lot of myths. One of them, for example, is that this is a very important kind of geopolitical gambit, which has some kind of rationale behind it, that it's basically about Russia's security. It is about NATO. It is about how the West betrayed Russia after the end of the Cold War. The situation that Putin created in Europe, something that definitely has never happened since World War II, and something I can compare as someone who covered the Balkans wars of the 90s, something basically compared to which the Balkans pale in comparison, become insignificant. Someone who started that couldn't be thinking about security, not speaking about European security, but Russian security. The insecurity that has been created around at least European Russia is staggering. And for as long as this regime will stay, this insecurity will continue, and this regime's insecurity will increase. We have Sweden and Finland joining NATO quite soon. Well, at least Finland definitely. We have Turkey reinventing itself as a mega player. Again, not only in the Black Sea region, but further beyond. We have Romania suddenly thinking about taking control over Moldova. Russian Rosatom, Russia's nuclear power plant, builder, one of the several state companies, state-owned enterprises that bring in some real cash, has been frozen out of most contracts. So there is no security. It was always about, the whole war in Ukraine was about two things, about the domestic legitimacy of the regime and about Putin's personal place in history. So I would say myth number two that is slain in, actually, as we speak, in the air over Lvov, which now experiences air defense barrage, is a myth about Putin, the calculating politician, the Nixon-style player in the Kremlin. And this war revealed him as someone who is bent on two things: personal prestige and survival of his regime. And I think that increasingly we see that this may not be, these things may not be compatible. I think myth number three is a myth that somehow the Russian people, Russian population, is basically oppressed by Putin, the majority. And given some freedom, it will turn towards, some kind of democracy, some kind of rule of law, and things like that. I think that this myth disappeared. Although I do not want, and I would like to be specific here, I do not want to go down the road of saying all Russians are culpable in what happened. Russian society carries quite some responsibility for what happened. Just I do that too. But I think what we discovered is that most Russians and most opinion polls that show this kind of allegedly huge numbers of support for Putin, if you go deeper, you discover that essentially the Russian society is not actively supporting Putin. It is dormant. In many ways, it's even probably worse than support, because essentially what you have the majority of people not supporting the Kremlin, not supporting the war, but choosing to support, i.e. relinquishing their political rights, their ability to, or right to impact, to influence politics. And people are just saying, well, we just give it to the Kremlin. They retreat into the comfort zone of imperial dreams, irresponsibility, and victimhood. And Putin played this card very, very smartly for the last more than 8 years, more than since 2014, by cultivating this cult of this idea of the Russian people as victims of the West and him as the savior. You don't need to do anything. Stay where you are. I'm going to fix it. And I think that now what we see a society which is, for now at least, incapable to influence and to make a difference with regard to a major event in Russian history, at least of the last 30 years. This portends quite a lot of trouble for Russia. I think that this combination of societal passivity, hidden aggression, free reign for a kleptocracy that runs Russia, and war is not exactly a recipe for success, to put it mildly. And I think that what we saw, this very strange combination of, on the one hand, the personal desire of one man to basically rectify the results of the Cold War, and the elite that is unwilling or incapable of countering that, even when it goes against its own interests, I think shows, and that's probably going to be the last thing I want to say, a significant weakness of the Putin system. It can survive on repression for some time, but I think that these repressions will not be able to go as far as to put this vast country under total control. I think that very turbulent times await Russia while the war continues, and especially when eventually it will end. Putin definitely shortened his stay in the Kremlin, but this shorter period will be tumultuous. And I'm not deliberately speaking about what happens in Ukraine because it's horrible, because it's morally and politically indefensible, and my position that is very clear. But strangely enough, the Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian political class are much more stable, even in these horrible times and during the war, than the Russian society and Russia's ruling clique. So I'd say that no matter what happens on the battlefield, looking forward, looking towards the coming years, buckle up. It's going to be very, very turbulent in Russia. Thank you very much, and I'm ready to take your questions.
Thank you very much for that very stimulating and even provocative beginning of our conversation. We've got a lot of questions already. And before I start asking them for people, I would first want to note that that if you have not done so yet, please type your questions into the Q&A window found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please be sure to include your full name and country. We won't be able to ask your questions if we don't have that information. Also, we will do our best to address all of your questions, but there seem to be quite a few, so we may not have time for all of them. We apologize in advance if we are unable to ask your question, but I'm going to try to do my best. And the first are two questions. The first two questions are about May 9th, next Monday. And the first is from Khaled Benhamou from Morocco. And here's the message. French newspaper The Figaro mentioned that Putin will be forced to call in a general mobilization, perhaps on May 9th, to cope with the current challenges. What are the chances of that happening? And similarly, Jonathan Gartner of the US asked, what should we expect in the run-up to Russia's celebration day of victory over Nazi Germany, May 9th?
Thank you very much for the questions. I'll try to predict what will happen, although Putin's unpredictable, as you know, and this is deliberate. Unpredictability is pretty much apart from nuclear weapons, unpredictability was for all these years pretty much the only political and diplomatic weapon that Putin's regime has. Apart from nukes, Russia is a country with an economy the size of, well, give or take, probably a bit more than Spain, in demographic decline, with low productivity, and as we've seen in Ukraine, mediocre armed forces. So being unpredictable is pretty much the only thing you can deploy against your adversaries, especially these adversaries are the collective West. So I cannot exclude anything. But if we look at more realistic options, to the question from the lady in Morocco, I think that there's not going to be a general mobilization. For one simple reason. This will give a lie to more than 2 months of relentless, bulldozer-like 24/7 propaganda that this is not war, but a very special, very limited operation to eradicate Ukrainian Nazism. That's how it's formulated. So suddenly saying, and by the way, your sons have now to be called up, is not going to be popular even among those who think that Ukraine should be nuked. Because, of course, everyone who wants Ukraine to be nuked wants to be 5,000 kilometers away. You know, armchair warriors are always most radical. But I think that a political calculation behind it should be very clear. War has started to arrive in its real form in Russian homes because the internet still functions. The Russian government refused, or rather not refused, but it can't shut down YouTube, for example, because that's a source of entertainment for tens of millions of people. People will not like that. So videos of atrocities, videos of maimed and killed Russian soldiers, columns of destroyed armor are gradually seeping into the furthest corners of Russia. So people will realize what will happen. And they will say, well, we don't want that. So what will happen, you'll have people hiding their sons, bribing the military call-up officials, the conscription sort of bureaus, and providing fake medical certificates that their sons are, you know, diabetics or have heart ailments or whatever. To buy such a thing is no problem. So no, I do not think it's going to be a mobilization. Because 9th of May, V-Day, was turned by Putin into basically the most important date in more than 1,000 years of Russian history. I think he's going to play on this symbolism. And one symbol that probably a lot of you don't know about is a parade that happened on the Red Square on 7th of November 1941 during Hitler's siege of Moscow. And Stalin was in Moscow at the time. He allegedly reviewed the parade from the mausoleum, although I suspect that footage was basically cooked. And the story goes that the Russian army, including reinforcements that arrived from Siberia, went straight to the front from Moscow. So basically, they hit the Germans in 2 hours since they left the Red Square. And I suppose that something like that is going to be played. Of course, Ukraine is more than, well, 1,000 kilometers away, nearly 1,000 kilometers away. But I think they're going to play on the symbolism. And another thing they may do, they may announce that they are creating a new so-called People's Republic in Ukraine, a third puppet state, which is probably going to be called the Kherson People's Republic, named after the city which was captured by the Russians and which controls water supply for the Crimea. I also do not exclude that Putin will announce that he's, I don't know, breaking out of diplomatic relations with the EU or with the US. I don't know, something purely political. What I do not believe in, and you'll take me to task if I was wrong, is I do not believe in mobilization. I think that actually the reserves of the Russian army, the ability to replenish ammo and material is still there. It's thinning gradually, but it's still there. I do not think they will spoil the date, and it's actually a holiday in Russia, day off, with telling the people your sons are going to be mobilized.
Okay, we've got a lot of questions coming in, so we want to make this as quick as possible to get everybody in.
Got you.
Next is Don Lovett from Canada. It's a little different kind of question. How does the situation speak to the very current relationship between Iran and the US?
Wow. What a turn.
Wanted to give you a chance to say
well,
a little different.
A lot of people dealing with the Middle East. I've been very much focused, with full disclosure, I've been very much focused on what happens in and around Ukraine. Didn't give Iran a lot of thought recently, but what I do think is that it will be that Russia's position in the Middle East, I do not think it will be strengthened overall. And I suppose that in terms of at least a view from Moscow, helping or not helping Joe Biden to organize, to set up a new JCPOA is one of the very few remaining levers that Putin has, and one of the very few remaining avenues of potential conversation with Washington. I do think that the Iranians must be having second thoughts about the long-term strategy of maintaining ties with Russia. If I were in Iran, I would think, oh, well, we don't know how it will pan out. But on the other hand, Putin's position as basically the king of Syria is still strong, and the Iranians can't disregard it. I think that if, for example, the US wants to somehow impact the Iranian positions, I'd say my feeling, and I may be wrong, is that it has to put out some feelers first. And maybe try and explain to the Iranians, who are probably not as good because of, well, isolation, at understanding what is at stake in Europe. Probably they should understand, explain through intermediaries, their long-term strategy with regard to Russia. And probably push them to distance themselves a little bit, because I believe that Putin's not going to win it. The question is, what's going to be the outcome? How is he going to lose it? So that's my question to that. I think that the US may have a chance to do some explanation to the Iranians and try to very gently sway them towards more cooperative approach.
Next question, very interesting question from Hitham Kayali of Palestine. Thank you for the presentation. Do you think Putin regrets starting this war? If he can go back in time, would he start it again? Was there any response by the international community that he hadn't expected?
Well, thank you very much. We all, Russia watchers, over the years, we turned into sort of amateur psychologists, amateur shrinks. But still, I do not claim to understand what Putin thinks. Even if he does think so, I think that he tries to hide it, because he's someone who looks at the world through a very specific prism. He measures everything by essentially just one scale, on essentially one scale: strength or weakness. And the result is, the consequence is either respect or contempt. That's very simply put, Putin's psychology. And I suppose that even if he understands that he's gone wrong, I think he won't go back, because for him it's a sign of weakness. To end it, he has to, I think this regime has to be either eliminated, or it has to suffer a catastrophic military defeat, which will be absolutely clear to everyone, including the last person in the last village near Khabarovsk. Then it will end. But I do think that he miscalculated massively. First miscalculation was, of course, completely misjudging Ukraine. It's very clear that he's been living in a myth of this weak state controlled by the oligarchs. He probably does believe that Ukrainians are just as Russians, just speaking this kind of weird dialect. He misjudged the Ukrainian armed forces, the strength of the Ukrainian civic society. And that tells you a very, very important story. Putin is surrounded by an equivalent of a medieval court, not by a functioning modern government. I mean, not even in the dictatorial sense of the word, because it's very clear that information that he received was absolutely wrong. Secondly, he misjudged the response of the international community. I think he judged Joe Biden on his, to my mind, mistaken attempted engagement last year when Putin concentrated troops for the first time along the border with Ukraine. He thought that Joe Biden's kind of weak old man who's lost it and so forth. He misjudged the European Union because he thought the European Union is like Germany. It goes where the money goes. He did not realize that even in the EU, which I criticize and continue to criticize quite a lot, there are certain red lines that will not be crossed. And killing civilians and shelling million-strong cities with Grad missiles is not something that even the last Putin-Versteher in Brandenburg will tolerate. And actually, I think that Europe will eventually go towards full embargo on Russian oil and gas. It may take more Ukrainian blood a lot. So I think Putin miscalculated all around, and he miscalculated on small things. I mentioned Sweden and Finland. So Putin was fighting this NATO enlargement all this time, and he ends up enlarging NATO big time. Now, the whole western border of Russia will be a border with NATO. I mentioned Rosatom being kicked out of deals across Europe, Czech Republic, Finland. Sanctions, very specific. If there are questions about the Russian economy, I'm prepared to answer them. Sanctions bite big time, or rather will bite big time, because any sanctions have to be judged, especially against a country like this, have to be judged probably first time 6 months after they were imposed. So yes, he miscalculated. He probably, I mean, somewhere in his sleep, he would like to go back, but alas, history is linear.
Okay, here is a question from Perry Bloom of the United States. How is the Russian regime likely to, in quotes, respond if Ukraine's conventional military forces prevail on the battlefield, as you just said is going to happen? Prevails here means that Russia's conventional military forces are not only defeated, but actually forced to withdraw from, or are in danger of being forced to withdraw from, the pre-2014 borders of Ukraine, including Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk. Do you think the Russians will take that?
Thank you very much. Great question. First and foremost, I'll believe that eventually Ukraine will return all the territories, including the Crimea. I'm not saying when it will happen, but I think Ukraine is, today, after February 24th, is much closer to that than it used to be before February 24th. How Putin is going to respond? Well, I think if the Russian forces are in danger of major catastrophic defeat, he may really use nuclear weapons. He may. However, I do think that this is still a toss-up, because I think he knows very well, and his generals, Defense Minister Shoigu, Chief General Staff Gerasimov, they all know there is no way Russia will prevail in an all-out war with NATO. And the fact that even if Putin uses tactical nukes, it's going to be an all-out war. I don't think that NATO will wait for any kind of, will not wait. That's I'm sure of. And frankly speaking, I think that Boris Johnson, who showed himself an amazingly astute politician, as already said, and I think that this warning was heard in Moscow. And in Moscow, they believe that Great Britain speaks for America. When Boris Johnson said, you use even a tactical nuke once, we don't care how, we'll feel free to strike you. So that may be a clamp, that may be a break on the use of nukes. But this catastrophic defeat, if it comes to it, by that time, maybe the domestic situation in Russia will be already pretty tumultuous, and people will have, or Putin will have, to decide And this choice may come. I'm not saying it will, but it may come. It may come to a very stark decision. Either you continue the war or you save the regime. And in these circumstances, I'm sure that he will prefer to save the regime. So I think that this is a possibility, but I do not think it's a possibility yet. And I think that Putin's generals will be telling him, look, if you don't act now in May, June, July, then the 33 billion, it's an amazing sum of dollars assigned to Ukraine for training and military purposes and stuff like that. They will eventually materialize in a year's time. The Ukrainian military, which are very highly motivated, and they've been training with NATO for quite a long time now. Their interaction with NATO was pretty close. They will actually start gaining ground with the modern weaponry which Russia doesn't possess. So they will be in a hurry. And alas, what they're going to do, they're going to resort to more barbaric means of war. Putin still has tens of millions of shells in his depots, dating back to Stalin. And they will continue indiscriminately destroying Ukrainian infrastructure and killing Ukrainians because the scare tactic is the only thing that remains for them. Everything else is pretty risky.
We have two questions on a topic you've referred to. Noha Bakr of Egypt, are we going to see Finland and Sweden giving up their neutrality? And Warren Fahmy of UCLA, what do you feel Putin's reaction would be should Finland and Sweden enter NATO? And you've said that's going to happen. So two of our participants were interested in that question. Let's look at it a little more.
Well, thanks for the question. Finland is very close from me, 1 hour flight to Helsinki. Frankly, Finland will join NATO. I think it's going to submit its official sort of request around about 14th of May or something like that. Swedes are still undecided, but frankly speaking, I think they will do it too. It's funny that I covered NATO for nearly 30 years, since 1994. And it's funny that people were all saying, if they're going to join, then Swedes are going to be first and Finns are going to be second. Now it's a complete reverse order because the Finns, having 1,500 kilometers border with Russia, feel much more vulnerable. Now, it will be very quick. I would like to correct you a little bit. Sweden and Finland are not neutral. They are non-aligned. Swedish and neutrality is about Liechtenstein, Austria, Switzerland. Swedish and Finnish forces have trained with NATO for decades. They achieved full interoperability with NATO. You will not need anything but to appoint military representatives and diplomatic, not even diplomatic, only military representatives to the NATO Council. That's it. And everything else is already pretty much there. So it will take only a political decision for them to join the alliance. This will be a major defeat, geopolitical defeat for Putin. Because the Baltic Sea will become essentially NATO Sea. The Swedish islands in the Straits will be NATO islands with, I'm sure, significant deployment there, or enhanced deployment. The Baltic Sea Fleet, which is pretty weak, Russian Baltic Sea Fleet, will be locked in this NATO lake. What can Putin do? The short answer, nothing. There is absolutely nothing he can do about this. He's not going to start nuclear war because of this. He's probably going to deploy an additional division or two. He's probably going to deploy more tactical nukes and make it very public along the border with Finland, for example. He's probably going to deploy more stuff to Kaliningrad, which, by the way, is now in bigger danger of NATO blockade than it ever was. The exclave, rather, Russian exclave, surrounded by Poland and Lithuania. But nothing else he can do. He can't hit Finland and Sweden economically. Well, he can downgrade diplomatic relations. Well, I don't think anyone will suffer from that. Propaganda, cyber operations, maybe trying to stir up trouble and give some money to maybe some sleeper ISIS cell in Malmö in Sweden. But that's the furthest he can go. I don't think he can do anything specific about it. And that is, by the way, that should increase his rage, because that's all he's doing. He's famously a great strategist.
I just want to mention that we have several questions coming up from several different countries, and we have had, and I'm sorry if I get your name pronounced a little incorrectly. I don't know all the languages. And even Americans, I don't always get it right. But anyway, we're going to Tunisia now, and Major Salwa Sahlul asks, is there any other opportunity to reactivate the operations of mediation with new approaches and team based on psychological and military and diplomatic strategy?
Well, thanks very much for the question. And I've been to Indonesia only once, but I loved it. And I think that, and it wasn't Bali, it was a real trip. But I think that there is always a possibility to have talks. And as far as I understand, several mediators are on standby. Well, ostensibly talks behind the closed doors or kind of on the background are still continuing. And as we know, Israel and Turkey were prepared to mediate. But I do think that until now, Putin has shown very little interest in real negotiation, in a sense that you give me this and I give you this. Because until now, he thought and probably still thinks that he eventually will prevail. He will just break Ukraine. And Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, he's now his country's chief warlord in a very positive sense, like Churchill was a warlord. That's what I mean. He's commander-in-chief. His troops gave blood on the battlefield. He can't just say, well, by the way, you know, now we start surrendering to Putin. And Putin wants nothing but surrender. And in this famous or rather infamous interview of Sergei Lavrov the day before yesterday to Italian television, which he started suddenly talking about Hitler being Jewish and stuff like that, Lavrov said very clearly, we do not want Zelensky to surrender. We want him to order his forces to surrender. This is the position of the Kremlin 48 hours ago. It didn't change. It's a non-starter for any kind of negotiation, serious negotiations with Ukraine. Ukraine now feels that it inflicted, at least unexpected, if not yet insufferable damage on Russia. So it will not negotiate even from a position from which Zelensky was prepared to negotiate on the 24th of February. And he will not be forgiven by his people. Zelensky is democratically elected. He has to protect his people, but he also has to take into account that the majority of Ukrainians do not want surrender. So for now, I do not see it happening. And by the way, the Pope offered to fly to Moscow and talk to Putin. He revealed it today in an interview with Corriere della Sera. And he said, I have no response from Putin. Putin just disregarding the Pope. I mean, he probably thinks he's Stalin, who famously asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? So I think that for now, I don't see any peace deal coming to fruition.
Our next question is from Hussein Al-Hawadi, Saudi Arabia. Given that nuclear threats have surfaced again, to what extent might this rhetoric affect the non-proliferation game?
I think the answer is quite obvious. This war, or this second stage of the same war, I think endangered international proliferation significantly. And I think that proliferation studies are now very prospective. I mean, I think looking for sponsors will not be particularly difficult for any university or academic institution. Because it's very clear that what Zelensky said is actually right. We could have retained nuclear weapons. Ukraine had enough of an industrial and scientific base in the early 90s to, well, remodel Russian arsenal to keep it. I think that now it's very clear that Putin is, to a large extent, well, I wouldn't say he's untouchable, but of course the impact on Russia is limited by its ability to deploy nuclear weapons. And Zelensky's Ukraine is weakened because it did not retain nuclear weapons. So I think that a rush to acquire nuclear weapons will be there. Those who have them will modernize, will probably go into all sorts of, well, tactical stuff, literally. I think that it's not so much, ballistic big missiles that will be of great interest, but rather all sorts of tactical devices. And it's going to spur on, of course, the development of missile technologies. And it's going to be a new edition of a mini nuclear arms race. It's clear that this war is will be spurring that on. That's my, I'm not a specialist in non-proliferation, but I'm certain it will happen. And by the way, the question coming from Saudi Arabia, well, who knows? Who knows about your country? And of course, the Iranians, coming back to a previous question, are watching it very closely, and I'm sure they're going to invest into their capability.
Thank you for combining these. And guess what? The next question is about Saudi Arabia to some extent. It's from Sergei Danilokhin from the USA and from the Czech Republic. Interesting combination. Konstantin, can you elaborate on Saudi-Russian connections and hydrocarbons?
All right. First of all, I would like to say hello to my good friend Sergei Danilokhin, whom I've known for close to 30 years now. Sergei, hello. Now, let me elaborate on Saudi and Russia. I think that there's going to be Saudi Arabia will continue to play hardball with the US with regard to Russia, not because it loves Putin, but because it feels its moment to show its real impact on global energy markets, maybe quite soon, its ability to acquire advanced weaponry, including advanced missiles and nukes. And of course, thirdly, to push the United States to being not accommodating towards Iran. I think that in this respect, you can expect Saudi Arabia to maintain links to Moscow, to not kind of occupy fully kind of pro-Washington position, if you wish, with regard to sanctions and isolating Putin. And by the way, I can imagine Mohammed bin Salman probably talking to Putin on the phone. I don't think meeting will be a good idea, but talking, probably taking part in some mediation effort. Why not? Putin doesn't have a lot of friends and a lot of people that he's prepared to speak to. Western mediation is basically out of the question for now. As for hydrocarbons, well, that's a question. The market is shrunk for Moscow. If we believe that in the end, quite soon, the EU is going to introduce a full oil ban, okay, phased but pretty quick, then it's going to hit Russian revenues very hard. Then the Chinese may go into play and buy more Russian oil, but they will ask for a big discount. What I do believe will not happen is, I don't know, the Saudis doing something to the oil market that will markedly help Putin. I do not think it will be taken lightly by Washington. So these are my observations for now, which are pretty superficial, but anyway, I hope I satisfied.
Questions are tough and varied. You have to know not everything for this crowd. And Michael Kafter of UCLA alum is next. A little bit of a changed topic. Israeli papers report about some barbs being exchanged between Russia and Israel. What are your comments about these?
Thanks very much for the question. I've been immersed in this wonderful scandal, or not so wonderful scandal actually, for the last 24 hours. It's actually continuing, and it started, if people don't know it yet, some of you, very briefly, it started with Lavrov's interview to Mediaset, which is the biggest Italian media group and one of the largest European media groups, which is owned by the family of Silvio Berlusconi, the former Prime Minister of Italy, and a big friend, or who used to be a big friend of Vladimir Putin. Now he's distanced himself from Putin after the assault on Ukraine. And this was a fairly mild interview. It wasn't completely unprobing, but it wasn't very hostile to Lavrov. And essentially, the journalist asked Lavrov whether he thinks that continuing this mantra, chanting these mantras in Moscow about Ukraine being run by a Nazi regime and the necessity to denazify Ukraine, whether it really corresponds to anything, because President Zelensky is Jewish, and there are not many signs of neo-Nazism in Ukraine. Of course, there are neo-Nazis in Ukraine, like they're in Sweden or in Russia, but they're not playing a first fiddle. They're in Ukraine, and Lavrov suddenly, for some reason, which I still don't understand, launched into a tirade in which he said, well, you know, this kind of questions of Jewishness are very dubious. The fact that Zelensky is Jewish doesn't mean anything. He presides over a Nazi regime, as we know. Sometimes Jews are the most hardline anti-Semites, and who knows, maybe Hitler was partly Jewish, and this was all completely uncalled for. This, of course, exploded the Israeli public space, and it elicited condemnations from people who, before that, were pretty cautious, because Israel has a very, very specific position with regard to Russia's war with Ukraine. But after criticism from the Israelis, the foreign ministry of Russia, and that was just a few hours ago, replied with an article in the barrage of tweets, which actually accused Jews of participating in the Holocaust and selling their own to the gas chambers. So this actually deepened the scandal. And I think that this tells you a very, very important story, and I'm grateful for the question. In Putin's system, especially after the Crimea, loyalty replaced everything else. Moreover, it's not only loyalty as such, it's continuous and increasingly frequent demonstration of loyalty that are demanded from the civil servants, essentially, especially the top of the regime. And this, because the regime is held by two forces. Putin operates Russia with two tools. He controls the Russian elite, the Russian political class, by two very simple tools: corruption and fear. You are allowed to be corrupt as long as you're loyal. The moment you become disloyal, there is a file on your corruption that's going to be used against you. You're going to be put in jail, or I don't know, something else. So all these people are afraid of Putin, and they have to show loyalty all the time. And Lavrov has been under enormous stress, of course, because he has to lie through his teeth 24/7. And I think he actually lost it. He offended a country, one of the very few Western countries, because Israel is essentially part of the West, in my view, at least. America's essential ally, you know everything. So Israel was very cautious with Moscow because of its position in Syria, because of its influence on Iran. Now, it was very difficult for the Israeli government, as far as I understand. There are any Israelis, they may correct me in the audience. But the majority, the public opinion polls in Israel show that the public does not support Putin. The public doesn't like Putin's war. And the government was actually just saying, well, for our own security, we have to maintain our own national interests. We don't have to criticize Putin. We don't have to condemn him in the UN, so on and so forth. And suddenly Lavrov lays it bare, essentially confirming every single prejudice. To my mind, it's not a prejudice, that lots of Israelis held, that Putin's regime is nothing but a new edition of the old anti-Semitic KGB-style dictatorship. And I think that it will be extremely difficult now to repair it. And I think that the Israeli government will have a big problem now maintaining its equidistance from the West and from Moscow because of extremely offensive, rude, and frankly speaking, just libelous things that Mr. Lavrov said. Even if you exclude morality and history from this equation, it's extremely unprofessional. In any other regime, even dictatorial, Lavrov would have been out of his chair on the 7th floor of the Russian Foreign Ministry building by now. But as I see it on push notifications on my screen, he's still there.
Wow. Okay. Next question kind of follows this in an odd way. Yeah, from Ilya Gukovsk at UCLA. What is your best realistic scenario for Russia? I might have kept this for the end, but it's not.
Well, great question. Thank you very much. I didn't get the name of the person who asked, but thank you.
Her name, I think it's her name, Ilya Gukovsk, UCLA.
All right. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that the realistic scenario and the best one will be the Putin regime not being able to go on with this war at a certain point in time. The economic sanctions finally biting stringently, and they will. If you listen to the Russian economic sort of top economists and top government officials responsible for the economy, they're very much concerned, especially about the export-import logistical chains being completely blown up by sanctions. This war will eventually become unpopular, really unpopular in Russia. It may take time, but it will. A combination of economic sanctions and unwillingness of the population to bankroll this war and to send their sons to fight in it may create first local and regional disturbances, then probably some kind of unease in the big cities. That may create, finally, an understanding inside the elites that they have to do something about it. As one former Russian senator told me, they will act, but they will only act against Putin when acting against Putin will inspire less fear than coming out on the street of Moscow, or I would add, driving along it in your Mercedes. I think at that time, we may have a change. And frankly speaking, I think anyone from inside the regime who will come after that will probably be minded to end it. Because someone who wants to continue it, I don't think he or she will appear, essentially. The only problem and the worst scenario that I see is Putin actually continuing with this and Russia starting to implode under the weight of economic sanctions, the war, and general demoralization. That will be a very bad scenario because an implosion of a nuclear state doesn't look as a very optimistic proposition to me. It may happen, but let us hope for some sane minds eventually being more afraid of their own people than of Putin. That's my scenario for today.
All right, I have, as the chair here, a bit of a problem because I have one person who's asking a very good question, but he's asked a question before, and I have another person who's asking 3 questions. So I will try to combine 2 of those 3 and pick up the other one because it's on China a little later, and we do want to discuss China. So let's go to Robert Turner of the United States. What is your reaction to the Pope's comment today that NATO started the war because they were like a dog barking at Russia's door. He said that. And his other question is, have you heard of Gorbachev's comments on the Russian war with Ukraine? Gorbachev? I know who Gorbachev
Yeah,
was.
well, we know who they are, but let me start with Gorbachev. No, I didn't hear anything about Gorbachev's comments. Last time I heard about him, he's very, very sick.
That's
He's
what I
living in-
thought.
He's living in 90 plus. He's quite sick. He's living in a very, very strict isolation. He was living during COVID. Hardly seen anyone, probably apart from his guards and cook and doctor. And I do not think he commented on that. I do not think he will, actually. I do not think he'll do it. I mean, no one can force him to do it. And luckily, because of COVID restrictions and because of his health, I don't think that anyone can badger him with questions. I think he will not comment on that. With regard to, I'm sure he's extremely pained by that. Extremely. I'm absolutely sure. And I'm sure that he would have handled it much better. Look, I don't want to comment on the Pope if he really said it. Full disclosure, I'm not a big fan of his. I think that he frequently shoots his mouth off on issues he'd rather keep silent on, especially with regard to Europe, of which he knows absolutely nothing. If he said it, then it's blaming the victim. It's a big mistake. I don't think it will add him any popularity in Ukraine, because essentially Ukraine is a sovereign state, by the way, with a lot of Catholics, Greek Catholics living, especially in the West, about 4.5 million, I think, Greek Catholics in his flock, with Roman Catholics probably up to 5 million in Ukraine. Ukraine has a sovereign choice to join any military alliance at once, under, by the way, the UN Charter. And NATO is not running around with advertising. It's not some kind of street salesman. Countries want to join NATO because it's, very simply speaking, the most successful defensive alliance in the history of this small planet. And I think that the Pope commenting on it was completely unnecessary. What I heard is that he said he is prepared to fly to Moscow. Maybe it's his way of trying to be objective, trying to mollify Putin, for him to let him go on a peace mission. Then maybe it could be explained by that. But if it's said out of this context, then, well, it's simply wrong.
Okay, Nicholas Kavalashvili from Georgia. Should Ukraine prevail, what are the prospects for South Caucasus, specifically Georgia?
Nicholas Gamarjoba. I think that if Ukraine wins, then Georgia, of course, has some chance of either recovering the territories or actually, to put it in a very cynical way, exchanging them for Russia looking the other way while Georgia joins NATO and the EU. That will be a decision but for the Georgian people and for the Georgian leadership. Alas, I do not think that the current Georgian leadership is in any position to negotiate toughly with Russia. But I think Ukraine can change it. On the other hand, since you mentioned other countries of Eastern Partnership of the EU and other countries aspiring to join NATO, I think that the move by Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova to submit their application to the EU is extremely important symbolically, politically, but also practically, because it actually shows that the winds are blowing away from Russia and towards the EU. It will take a long time, but it's important. Last but not least, let us watch Moldova, because that's a place where Putin may try and start trouble. That borders on Romania. This may bring NATO into play, because Romania cannot stay indifferent to the fate of hundreds of thousands of Romanian citizens living in Moldova. If Putin avoids this trap, then maybe the situation will eventually just limit itself to Ukraine, where eventually I think he will suffer a fiasco politically and maybe even militarily. Before that, I think Georgia, there's not going to be any movement on Georgia. After it, yes, it's going to be very significant. It will be significant for Georgia, for Moldova, for Ukraine, for Armenia, for Azerbaijan, and even for Kazakhstan. It's going, I mean, it is already, this war is already reshaping the whole of what used to be called the post-Soviet space. Watch Central Asia very attentively. And South Caucasus, of course, will remain very, very important.
Well, what you,
to you, Nicholas. Thank you very much.
What you just said, I think the next question follows. It's from Nabila Al-Mullah from the American University of Kuwait. Can you envisage a scenario in the near future for a Russian nation without Putin? You did say that a little bit in your talk. But...
Yes, I think that Putin should, I mean, look, as you know, Putin amended the constitution. Many people will say he just raped it 2 years ago, creating a possibility for him to be re-elected, quote unquote, which is not a real election, for another 2 6-year terms when his current term ends in 2024. That means he plans to stay until 2036, when he will be 84. Well, I do not think that it's now plausible. I can imagine Russia without Putin. In my previous scenario, I described that I can imagine that if things really go sour across Russia, socially and economically, then I think people may act against Putin, people in his own entourage. It will be difficult. You've seen this huge table that he sits at. He's evidently very much concerned about his security. There is a flip side to that, a positive side. I think that, and many people are saying, many Russians I know, many observers in Europe are saying that someone who's so careful and someone who treasures his life and security so much probably will not start a nuclear war. Maybe that's an explanation. Maybe that's something we should be looking forward to. But yes, I can imagine eventually Russia will be without Putin. And as I said, I think by this war, he made this even more possible and made time left until this shorter. Question is, what will happen to Russia?
Eric Selkov in the United States, from the United States, why doesn't Ukraine attack Russia in Moscow and make the Russians realize how serious the war is?
Well, you probably, what's the name of the gentleman who asked the question? Richard?
Eric.
Eric Selkov.
Eric, thank you very much for the question. I think that you probably heard and read and saw videos of an increasingly frequent, sort of serious, increasingly intense series of mysterious fires at Russian ammunition depots and all sorts of government institutions, including a missile research institute in Tver in northwestern Russia. You're asking about Moscow specifically. Well, I have news from Moscow for you. Today, at a huge storage facility of a government printing house, which prints school textbooks, there was a huge fire, very, very difficult. They had about 150 firemen fighting it. There was enormous surface that was burning, more than 33,000 square meters. And you know what? It was not just a book storage facility. It was a state publisher that was publishing history books in which, and this publishing house, promised officially that they're going to erase Ukraine from all the textbooks. So suddenly their textbooks are burning. Maybe it's an accident. I do not think that the time has yet come. I'm not a military expert. First, my military experience is limited to 73 years as a junior officer in the Soviet army. But I think the Ukrainians haven't taken yet a decision to strike, openly strike targets in Moscow. First and foremost of all, striking Moscow, maybe you strike some civilians. That's what they really want to avoid. I think they want to make a very, very clear distinction between the way the Russian army is waging war, indiscriminately killing lots of civilians, you know, this pillage, rape, marauding, and stuff like that, and them. But to me, it's very clear. It's not an accident. Some governors of southern Russian regions already admitted that, for example, bridges that were blown up, it's not an accident. They were blown up, essentially. So I think that what Ukraine has been preparing, and I'm sure they were preparing for this for years, is actually a war of saboteurs across Russia. I mentioned the fire at a research facility in Tver. Well, Tver is 2,000 kilometers from Ukrainian border. Of course, I think that Ukrainian special services, it seems like, they use the fact that any Ukrainian can pass for a Russian and vice versa. There are lots of southern Russian accents that are like Ukrainian. So I think recruiting or planting people was not that difficult. And it seems that now they are acting. So it's a kind of, you know, this old, very silly US thriller, which was called A Fake Telephone, where KGB agents are activated by telephone from their sleep and start going on a sabotage mission. So I don't know whether it's the new version of telephone, but it's very clear they're doing something about it. And yes, I think that eventually, if war continues, they're going to strike military targets at least close to the Russian border. And we'll see what will happen in the capitals. But as I said, I think they're very careful to be distinct from the Russian army and not to threaten civilians.
From Bassem Shab of Lebanon, do you expect turmoil in Kaliningrad if Russia admits defeat in Ukraine?
I don't think there's going to be turmoil. And actually, I've been to Kaliningrad. Good question. It depends on what's going to be the environment. If you go to Kaliningrad, there are lots of people there, especially young people, who have never been to Moscow, but they've been to Gdańsk and other surrounding Polish cities. They will tell you where they serve the best cocktails in Gdynia. There's this border agreement for non-visa border exchange, I think, to the limit of 150 kilometers from the border of Kaliningrad Oblast into Poland. So people there live essentially inside the EU. And frankly, the Russian government policy towards it, including economic policy, was not very clever. It's not a very well-developed region. It lost a very significant revenue now because BMW, that had its main plant in Russia, assembly plant, shut it down or is in the process of shutting it down. So economically, Kaliningraders will suffer. And I think what you can expect is that they're going to now be subjected to brainwashing by the Russian propaganda, saying that you're going to be conquered and slaughtered by the Poles, something like that. But it will be difficult to convince them of that because they know who the Poles are. So I think that eventually, if Russia starts to disintegrate, this is going to be a piece of Russia where I can imagine some kind of local bosses announcing the Baltic Russian Republic of Kaliningrad. That will start with signing free trade agreements with Lithuania and Poland. But it has to be Russian disintegration. That is not impossible, but it's not on the cards now. And as I said, it's going to be very dangerous. I hope you answered.
All right. As we move towards our conclusion, I'm going to let two people who have very good questions who asked before. First of all, Perry Bloom of the USA. How long is China likely to remain politically supportive of Russia? What kinds of information or changes in the battlefield situation are likely to impact China's current position?
Well, I think that this essentially a question to follow up. My feeling is that support for Putin was, well, underwhelming, to put mildly. There's a lot of diplomatic and political support. Of course, they're buying Russian oil. I think they will be prepared to buy more of Russian energy with some discount. Probably it's not going to be exorbitant. I don't think they're going to fleece Putin and use his weakness. But I think that any kind of help from China is conditional on the situation on the battlefield. Let me give you my guess. It's just a guess. We discussed a potential peace deal, which I think is very vague and sort of, in the clouds for now. But I think if there is any kind of more or less stable, let's not say peace deal, but even ceasefire, to which the Ukrainians will put some kind of signature, be it by Zelensky or by his plenipotentiary, then it will give an excuse to the Chinese to say, well, at least there is some semblance of stability and, well, missiles are not flying. Well, the Ukrainians agreed to that, so maybe we can cooperate closer with Putin. Over time, I think this Chinese strategy will be like this. It's going to be a very gentle quid pro quo. For example, we help to modernize your railways in exchange for, let us say, 10% of Russian railways SOE and one place, just one place, on the board of directors. Oh, you want spare parts for Sukhoi Superjet? That's fine. We can probably do a replica of the Italian stuff completely copyright free. But, probably would like 50% of Sochi Airport. Or something else, I don't know, Khabarovsk Airport or Vladivostok Harbor. I think that it's going to be this kind of very clear promotion of Chinese, quote unquote, investment in strategic sectors of Russian economy, especially in the Far East and Siberia. Military, probably some. I actually do not think the Chinese will jump out of their pants to help Putin militarily. On the other hand, they do not want Putin's defeat. That's going to be a big plus for America, and they're going to be left alone. I'm sure they're learning things about Taiwan, and frankly, looking at the response by the West, which Putin didn't expect. If I were sitting in Beijing, I'm not a specialist on Chinese policy, not at all. But logically speaking, I'll be thinking whether I really want to launch an amphibious invasion or something like, whether I really want to do some tricks with the Taiwanese. And by the way, sitting in Lithuania now, which, as we know, has a big row, ongoing row with China over its essentially opening a quasi-embassy of Taiwan in Vilnius. Well, the EU compensated Lithuanian companies 130 million euros for the unfair trade practices by the Chinese. That will not go unnoticed. So I think they're drawing their conclusions, and these conclusions are not necessarily optimistic for them in terms of at least the quote-unquote reunification of the Chinese homeland.
So we have two more major questions that have come in. And let me tell the audience they are real whoppers. I think there are more questions coming. I never know in a new system we're using. I don't know that we'll have time for them. The first one is Warren Fahmy of UCLA, a good friend personally. Given the rise of food insecurity, particularly grain, and potential loss of revenue from tourism, with Russians and Ukrainians unable to travel to MENA, do you see an outside chance of one or more countries from the MENA region trying to mediate some sort of ceasefire? Maybe Turkey?
Mhm. Well, Turkey remains the strongest candidate for that, even stronger than Israel, I think, and definitely stronger than the Pope. Because one simple reason. It has good relations with both capitals. And what's even more important, Putin respects Erdogan. Putin respects Erdogan exactly because Erdogan shut down his plane. Putin alone respects those who hit him. And I think that Turkey may play a mediation role, but as I mentioned before, it will have a problem because both sides will have a certain set of completely unmovable and unshakable positions from the beginning, more than they would have had if the mediation started on the 23rd of February. And I suppose that with Western support for Ukraine, with the $33 billion, with Boris Johnson saying we are throwing another, well, nearly actually $500 million at Ukraine today, incentives to stop are fewer for Zelensky. And Putin probably understands that, and Putin will continue to smash what he can in Ukraine. That will increase, radicalize the Ukrainians. So you have a bit of a vicious circle. So if you want mediation, you have to do it now, and you have to do it in a very dramatic fashion. And I don't think that Erdogan for now is ready for any kind of drama. But yes, food insecurity is there. And of course, as you know, Russia is basically stealing Ukrainian grain now. There are lots of reports about also Russia basically apprehending and moving to its own territory not only grain, but agricultural equipment. And not for nothing, because a lot of seeds Russia was buying from the West. And now a lot of it is under sanctions. So Russia has, for example, hardly any homegrown flowers. Flowers are not a big necessity now, but still. One simple reason, all seeds are bought in Europe or in Asia. So it is an issue, but I think one has to find a very, very strong and original move and incentive for both sides. And one thing for sure, one non-starter is talking about Ukraine's neutrality. Forget it. The word neutrality should be just forgotten and struck out of any lexicon debating Russia and Ukraine.
All right, we come to the last question. And here it is from Bob Wolf in the US. Will Putin's weakness increase his incentive to interfere in US elections, whether in 2022 or 2024, to promote politicians who would promote more isolationist, less pro-NATO policies?
Yes. The simple answer is yes, he will. He still has capacity to do it. And in this vast thing and mysterious thing, like, whatever, the face on Mars or something like that, which is called the Russian military budget, which is an all-encompassing, shape-shifting thing, which includes pretty much everything, including, as far as I understand, all things cyber. Putin is not going to let on any kind of expenses on the military, the FSB, the whole secret police, Rosgvardia, and propaganda, and his cyber spooks. So definitely there are going to be attempts to impact US elections. Lots of people are getting huge budgets for that as we speak. I have no doubt about that. As always, as you know, Putin is an equal opportunity employer. as in Europe as in America, he will give money to the hard left or the hard right, whoever promotes his interests. But what I think is that there's going to be a heightened attention to that in the US, I'm sure about it. And I also think that the cyber attack we saw like 3 weeks ago, which for a couple of hours actually incapacitated pretty much the whole of the Russian bureaucracy. Well, if Uncle Vladimir crosses some kind of invisible red line that I'm sure someone's going to draw for him, he may suffer much bigger losses in terms of cyber counterattack. And he is much more vulnerable here and weakened. But he is not going to let up on that. There's no doubt about it. And I'm sure that lots of people are now coming and saying, just give us another $1 million, or $1 million peanuts, okay. Give us another $100 million, and we are going to hit this US sort of aggressors very hard. As I told you, in Putin's car, in his gearbox, there is no such thing as a letter R, reverse. Wow.
So we come to our conclusion. What an experience, Konstantin, and it's a marvelous presentation. And I'm sure I speak for everyone who both was on this program and who will be listening to it in the next few days as we make it available. I'm sure some of us will be telling our friends, this is it, you got a lesson. I'd also like to thank our team for creating this opportunity for us to talk today. Manny Jad, Salome Mahajer, Samar Smesmi, Emily Pistol, and Rita Dahi. If you are interested in past and future CMED events, please see your screen or chat window for more information. In particular, please join us on May 19th for A View from Ukraine, the war's implications for Turkey and the wider MENA region. So, and we just heard that Turkey is the party, if there would be one, unlikely, but still if there would be one, most likely to be able to do some good as things stand right now. So again, great, thank you.
My microphone is still on. Can I thank you, UCLA, and everyone who was present and asked these wonderful questions. You made me think. You made me think about some of my shortcomings. I'll be better prepared next time. Many, many thanks to you. And many thanks, Professor Spiegel.
Thank you. And thank you to all the people who asked those tough questions. So interesting. And with this, Konstantin, I think we will have to say goodbye, to each other and to everyone who's been part of this program. And I have to, unfortunately, conclude it. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.